It was just another Friday evening in the quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge. Trees lining the sidewalks, porch lights flickering on one by one, the distant hum of a lawnmower winding down. The air carried that soft mix of cut grass and barbecue smoke, the kind of peace people move to suburbs hoping to find. A man stepped out of his house wearing a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and well-worn sneakers. He'd had a long week, meetings, budget reviews, late-night calls, and all he wanted was to clear his head. No uniform, no radio, no badge on display. Just a walk. He lived just 3 blocks from the city's main police station, but tonight he wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about his daughter's school play next week, the leaky kitchen faucet he kept forgetting to fix, and whether he'd finally get around to planting those tomato seeds in the backyard. He walked slowly, hands tucked in his pockets, earbuds in, listening to a podcast about how cities can build better trust between police and the people they serve. It was a topic close to his heart, not just because of his job, but because of the conversations he'd had with his own father years ago, back when being a black man in a uniform didn't always protect you from being seen as a threat. The neighborhood was familiar. He'd walked these streets dozens of times before, often late at night after long shifts. Most folks knew him by now. Some waved, others nodded politely. But tonight, 2 patrol cars rolled by a little slower than usual. There'd been a few reports of car break-ins over the past few days, nothing major, but enough to put officers on edge. He didn't notice the cars at first. He was focused on the voice in his ear talking about community policing, about how real safety starts with respect, not suspicion. He paused near a parked sedan, not because he was looking at it, but because his phone buzzed with a text from his sister. He glanced down, thumbs hovering over the screen, deciding whether to call her back or wait until he got home. That's when the headlights hit him. A patrol car pulled up behind him, tires crunching softly on the pavement. Then another. Doors opened. Boots hit the ground. He looked up, surprised but not alarmed. He figured they might ask if he'd seen anything unusual. After all, he knew how patrols worked. "Hey there," one officer said, voice firm but not unfriendly. "What are you doing around here?" He pulled out one earbud and offered a small smile. "Just heading home," he said calmly. "Live right down the street." The officers exchanged a glance. One of them stepped closer, hand resting near his belt. "You got ID on you?" "Sure," he said, keeping his movements slow and clear. He reached toward his back pocket for his wallet, the same way he'd done 1,000 times before, even in uniform. But this time something shifted. The officer's posture tightened. "Keep your hands where I can see them." He froze. "I'm just getting my ID," he said, voice steady but firm. "I'm not reaching for anything else." But the moment had already tilted. What should have been a routine exchange, a neighborly check-in, was now spiraling into something else. The second officer moved in fast, barking orders. Before he could react, strong hands grabbed his arms, twisted them behind his back, and shoved him face first onto the sidewalk. His knees hit the concrete hard. The earbud popped out. The podcast kept playing faintly in the grass. "Stop resisting," one of them shouted, even though he hadn't moved except to brace his fall. "I'm not resisting," he said, voice muffled against the pavement. "I'm the police chief." The words hung in the air, but they didn't land, not yet. The officers were locked into their script. Suspicious person, possible threat, control the situation. They didn't hear the calm authority in his voice. They didn't see the man. They saw a scenario they'd been trained to fear. His wrists burned as the cuffs clicked shut. A neighbor on the porch gasped. Someone else pulled out a phone. He stayed still, breathing slowly, repeating quietly, "I'm the chief." "Check my jacket." Badges in the inside pocket. One officer finally reached into his coat, hesitant, skeptical, and pulled out a leather holder. He flipped it open under the streetlight, and that's when everything stopped. The name, the title, the official seal of the Crestwood Police Department. The officer's face went pale. He looked at his partner. His partner stared back, eyes wide. The man on the ground didn't yell, didn't curse, just said, "Now do you believe me?" Around them, the neighborhood held its breath. Porch lights glowed. Crickets chirped. And in that quiet moment, something deeper than embarrassment settled over the scene. A sudden, sharp awareness of how quickly things can go wrong when fear overrides judgment. The officers helped him up quickly, fumbling with the cuffs, stammering apologies. But the damage wasn't just in the scrapes on his elbows or the ache in his shoulders. It was in the realization that even someone at the very top of the department, someone who dedicated his life to law enforcement, wasn't immune to being seen as a suspect first, a person second. He brushed off his jeans, picked up his phone, and looked at the two officers not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. "We've got a lot of work to do," he said simply. Then he walked home, not as a chief, not as a symbol, but as a man who'd just been reminded, in the most jarring way possible, that the uniform only protects you if people choose to see it. And as he turned the corner toward his house, the porch light still on, waiting for him like always, he knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow wouldn't just be another day at the office. It would be the start of something bigger, something necessary, because if it could happen to him on his own street in his own town, then it could happen to anyone. And that wasn't just a personal injustice. It was a failure of the whole system. But failures, he believed, were also chances to fix things. And he wasn't about to waste this one. The two officers stood there, frozen like statues under the yellow glow of the streetlight. One still held the leather badge holder, fingers stiff, eyes darting between the official seal and the man standing calmly in front of them. The other kept glancing around as if hoping someone would step in and tell him this was all a mistake, some kind of cruel prank. But the silence from the nearby porches and sidewalks told a different story. People were watching, recording, remembering. The man didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, shoulders slightly hunched from the rough handling, his hoodie now dusty and twisted. He rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. "You can call dispatch," he said evenly. "Tell them the chief is on Oak Ridge Avenue. They'll confirm it." One officer fumbled for his radio, hands shaking just enough to betray his panic. He pressed the button, cleared his throat twice, and finally got out a shaky, "This is Unit 14 requesting verification of, an individual's identity." He gave the location, then added in a lower voice, "Says he's the chief." Back at the station, the dispatcher paused. Then came a dry, knowing reply. "Copy that, Unit 14. Yes, the chief is off duty tonight. He lives in that neighborhood. You're speaking to him." The officer lowered the radio slowly. His partner's face had gone completely still, like someone who just realized they'd walked off the edge of a cliff and hadn't fallen yet, but knew it was coming. "I'm sorry." "Sir?" the first officer finally managed, voice tight. We had no idea." The man nodded once, not to accept the apology but to acknowledge it. "I know," he said. "That's exactly the problem." A neighbor, a woman who'd lived on the block for over 20 years, stepped off her porch and walked over. She didn't say anything at first, just handed him a bottle of water she'd grabbed from her fridge. He took it with a quiet, "Thank you." She gave the officers a long, hard look before turning back to him. "You okay?" she asked softly. "I will be," he replied. The officers stood awkwardly, unsure what to do next. Protocol said release him. Common sense said apologize again. But pride and fear kept them stiff. They'd been trained to control situations, not to be the ones who messed up in front of a crowd. One finally bent down and picked up the earbud from the grass, offering it back like it might fix everything. It wouldn't. Word spread fast. Within minutes, someone had posted a short clip online. Shaky footage of a man in a hoodie being pinned down, then the stunned silence when the badge came out. No dramatic music, no captions, just raw real life. People started sharing it with captions like, "This happens even to the chief? And if he's not safe, who is?" At the precinct, the night shift buzzed with nervous energy. Some officers groaned, embarrassed for their own. Others muttered about overreacting or just doing their job. But deep down, even the most defensive among them felt a knot in their stomach. Because they knew, everyone knew, that if the man on the ground had been anyone else, if he hadn't carried that badge, this might have ended very differently. And that thought didn't sit right. Back on the street, the man finally turned to leave. "Don't worry," he told the officers quietly. "We'll talk Monday. All of us." Then he walked away, not fast, not angry, just tired. Tired of explaining, tired of being doubted, tired of having to prove he belonged in his own city. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he sat on a bench at the small park at the end of the block, the one with the old oak tree and the swing set his daughter used to love. He unscrewed the water bottle and took a long sip. His hands were steady now, but his mind was racing. He thought about the training sessions he'd pushed for: de-escalation, bias awareness, community walks. Some officers rolled their eyes during those meetings, called them soft or political. But tonight proved they weren't soft. They were necessary. Life or death necessary. He also thought about his team. Not just the 2 officers who'd tackled him, but the whole department. Good people, most of them, hardworking, trying their best. But trying wasn't enough when lives were on the line. When trust was on the line. His phone buzzed. A text from the mayor's office. "Heard what happened. Are you all right? We need to talk first thing," he typed back. "I'm fine. But we've got work to do." As he stood to leave, a teenager on a bike slowed down nearby. "Hey," the kid said. "That was you on the video, right?" The man nodded. The teen hesitated, then said, "My cousin got stopped last week for walking home from the library." They searched his backpack. "He didn't do anything wrong." "I know," the man said gently, "and I'm going to make sure things change." The kid didn't look convinced, but he didn't look hopeless either. He just nodded and pedaled off into the night. Back at his house, he found his daughter waiting up, wrapped in a blanket on the couch. She'd seen the clip too. "Dad," she said, eyes wide, "why did they do that to you?" He sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. "Because sometimes people see skin color before they see a person. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to help them see better." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad you're home." "Me too," he said. Later, alone in his study, he opened his laptop. Not to file a complaint, though that would come, but to draft a new training outline. Mandatory for everyone. Starting with a simple question. What would you do if the person you stopped turned out to be your boss? Your neighbor? Your friend? Because the real test of policing isn't how you treat the obvious criminals. It's how you treat the ordinary person who looks suspicious just by existing. He stayed up late, typing, revising, thinking. Outside, the neighborhood settled into quiet. Streetlights hummed. Crickets sang. And somewhere, 2 officers sat in their patrol car, replaying the moment over and over, wondering how they'd missed what should have been clear from the start. No one slept well that night. But maybe that was a good thing. Because real change rarely begins in comfort. It starts in the uncomfortable silence after a mistake, when you finally see what you've been blind to. And this time, the whole city was watching. The next morning, the precinct felt different, like the air itself had gotten heavier. Officers moved quietly through the halls, avoiding eye contact, speaking in hushed tones near the coffee machine. The usual banter was gone. Even the clatter of keyboards and radios seemed muted, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what came next. Upstairs, in the chief's office, the blinds were open for once. Sunlight streamed in, hitting the framed photos on the wall. Community events, award ceremonies, a group shot with cadets from the youth academy. But the man behind the desk wasn't looking at any of that. He was watching the clock. 9 a.m. The meeting was set for 9:30. He'd called in the 2 officers involved, their sergeant, the head of internal affairs, and the union rep. No one knew exactly what to expect, but everyone knew this wasn't just another routine debrief. Down in the locker room, the 2 officers sat side by side on a bench, still in uniform, though neither had gone on patrol yet. One kept fiddling with his duty belt, tightening and loosening the strap like it might somehow undo the night before. The other stared at the floor, jaw clenched. They hadn't slept. They'd replayed every second, the way they'd approached, the tone of their voices, the split-second decision to use force. They'd told themselves they were just being cautious, following procedure, protecting themselves. But now, with daylight and clarity, those excuses felt thin, like tissue paper over a crack in the wall. One finally broke the silence. "Do you think he'll fire us?" The other didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "I don't know, but maybe he should." That admission hung between them, raw and honest, because deep down they both knew they hadn't seen a person last night. They'd seen a profile, a stereotype, a checklist of fears drilled into them over years of training that emphasized threat over humanity. And that mistake hadn't just hurt someone, it had shaken the trust of an entire community. At 9:20, they walked upstairs together, shoulders stiff, steps slow. The hallway seemed longer than usual. When they reached the office door, it was already open. The chief stood by the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the parking lot below. He turned when they entered. No anger in his eyes. No shouting. Just a quiet disappointment that somehow hurt more than yelling ever could. "Sit down," he said. They did. The sergeant and internal affairs rep were already there, along with the union representative who looked equal parts nervous and defensive. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the chief walked to his desk, picked up a tablet and tapped the screen. Body cam footage filled the monitor, grainy but clear enough. There they were, pulling up, shouting commands, tackling a man who hadn't raised his voice or made a sudden move. The audio crackled with tension. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting." "Hands behind your back." "I'm the chief." He let it play until the moment the badge was revealed. Then he paused it. "Tell me," he said, voice calm, "what part of that looked like a threat to you?" The officers exchanged glances. One cleared his throat. "Sir, we'd had multiple calls about suspicious activity in that area. We saw someone standing by a car late at night, hoodie up. You just assumed," the chief finished gently. "And that assumption cost you your judgment." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of what happened was already pressing down on all of them. "I've watched this footage 5 times, he continued. 5 times I've listened to myself say I'm the police chief, and 5 times I've heard it ignored. Not because you didn't hear me, but because you didn't believe me. And why? Because I didn't look like what you think a chief should look like." The room stayed silent. Even the union rep had nothing to say. Then the chief leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "I'm not here to destroy your careers, but I am here to make sure this never happens again. Not to me and not to anyone else in this city. Because if you can't see me as your chief when I'm in a hoodie, how can I trust you'll see a teenager walking home from school as anything but a suspect?" One of the officers looked like he might cry. "We messed up," he said, voice cracking. "We really did." "Yes," the chief said. "You did. But messing up isn't the end, it's the beginning of learning. If you're willing." He stood up and walked to the whiteboard on the wall. He picked up a marker and wrote 2 words. "See people." "This," he said, tapping the words, "is going to be our new standard. Not control the situation, not assume the worst. See people, before the uniform, before the badge, before the call, just people." He turned back to them. "You're both placed on administrative duty starting today. Not as punishment, but as a reset. You'll go through retraining. Implicit bias, de-escalation, community engagement. You'll ride with veteran officers who've built real trust in neighborhoods like Oak Ridge. And when you come back, you'll do it differently. Or you won't come back at all." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Later that afternoon, the chief held a short press briefing outside the station. No podium, no fancy setup. Just him, a few reporters, and a handful of concerned residents who'd shown up. He didn't hide what happened. He described it plainly. "Last night I was mistaken for a suspect in my own neighborhood. I was detained without cause. It was a failure of judgment, but also an opportunity." He announced the new training program, the review of use of force policies, and a plan to create a civilian advisory board made up of local residents, business owners, and youth leaders. "Real change doesn't happen behind closed doors," he said. "It happens when we listen, to each other, to our mistakes, and to the people we're sworn to protect." As he spoke, a group of high school students stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, watching closely. One held a sign that read, "If not us, who? If not now, when?" He caught their eyes and gave a small nod. They didn't smile, but they didn't look away either. That evening, back in Oak Ridge, neighbors gathered on porches again. But this time, the talk wasn't just about what happened, it was about what could come next. A retired teacher suggested organizing a Meet Your Officer night. A local shop owner offered space for community forums. Even kids were talking about it at the bus stop. And in his living room, the chief sat with his daughter again. She was drawing something. A picture of a police officer and a man in a hoodie shaking hands under a big sun. "Is this us?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah, you and you," he smiled. "I like that." Because in her eyes there was no contradiction. No off-duty versus on-duty. No suspect versus chief. Just a person, trying to do right. Even when the world makes it hard, and maybe, just maybe, that's where real change begins. Not in policy manuals or press conferences, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see each other fully, hoodie and all. The days after the incident moved fast, but also strangely slow, like time was holding its breath. Word had spread beyond the city limits. News vans parked outside the police station, not with flashing lights or dramatic music, but with quiet curiosity. Reporters weren't shouting questions. They were listening. And for once, the department wasn't hiding behind no comment. Inside the station, things felt different. The usual clatter of boots on tile, the loud radio chatter, the jokes in the break room, all of it had softened. Officers moved with more care, spoke with more thought. Even the way they greeted each other changed. A simple "you good?" now carried weight, because everyone knew what happened could have happened to anyone, and that truth settled deep in their bones. The two officers involved hadn't returned to patrol. They were in classrooms now, sitting through sessions they'd once rolled their eyes at. One session focused on implicit bias, not the kind you shout about, but the quiet kind that lives in your gut. The kind that makes you lock your car doors when you see someone walking toward you at night. The kind that makes you assume someone's guilty before they've said a word. At first, they sat with arms crossed, defensive. But then the instructor showed real footage, dozens of clips from body cams across the country. In every one, a black man doing something ordinary, waiting for a bus, checking his phone, walking home. And in nearly every one, the interaction escalated fast, not because of what the person did, but because of how they were seen. One of the officers raised his hand. "But we're trained to be alert," he said, "to spot threats." "Yes," the instructor replied gently. "But are you trained to question your own assumptions? Because a threat isn't just what someone is, it's what you believe they are." That hit hard. Meanwhile, the chief spent his mornings meeting with community leaders, pastors, teachers, small business owners, even teenagers from the local high school. He didn't come with answers. He came with questions. What do you need from us? What don't we see? Where have we failed you? At one meeting in a church basement, an older woman stood up. She'd lived in Oak Ridge for 40 years. "I've called your department 3 times in the last 2 years, she said, voice steady. "Once when my neighbor's dog got loose, once when a streetlight went out, and once when I saw someone trying to break into a car. Each time the officer treated me like I was wasting their time. It's like I didn't belong here." She paused. "And I've lived here longer than most of your officers have been alive." The chief didn't make excuses. He just said, "Thank you for telling me. That stops now." Back at the station, he made a quiet change. Every new call now started with a simple question on the dispatch log. Is the caller a longtime resident? Not to give special treatment, but to remind officers that the person on the other end might be someone who's built this community, brick by brick, year by year. Then came the town hall, held in the high school gym, neutral ground open to all. Over 300 people showed up. Not just the usual activists, but families, retirees, shopkeepers, even a few off-duty officers sitting in the back. Listening. The chief stood at a simple mic, no podium, no uniform, just a button-down shirt and tired eyes. He started by apologizing. Not just for what happened to him, but for every time someone in that room had been made to feel like a stranger in their own neighborhood. "I wear a badge," he said. "But last week, it didn't matter. Because before anyone saw my badge, they saw my skin. And that's on us, not just the 2 officers that night, but all of us who've let this system run on assumptions instead of humanity." He announced 3 big changes. First, every officer would spend 1 shift a month walking beats in civilian clothes. No radio, no gun, just talking to people. Not to gather intel, but to build relationships. Second, the department would publish monthly reports on stops, searches, and use-of-force incidents broken down by race, age, and neighborhood, so the public could see the patterns, not just the promises. Third, a new community trust council would be formed, made up of residents from every part of the city, with real power to review policies and suggest changes. After he spoke, the floor opened for questions. Some were angry, some were hopeful. One young man asked, "How do we know this isn't just another PR move?" The chief didn't flinch. "You don't, not yet. But watch what we do, not what we say. If we're serious, you'll see it in 6 months. If we're not, call us out, loudly." That night, as he walked home again, yes, he still walked because stopping would mean fear had won, he passed the same spot where it all happened. The sidewalk looked the same. The streetlight still flickered, but something had shifted. A neighbor watering her plants saw him and waved. "You holding up okay?" she called. "I am," he said. Better than before, maybe, she nodded. Good, we're rooting for you. Inside his house, his daughter had left a note on the kitchen table. Proud of you, Dad. Underneath, she'd drawn a heart. He smiled. The next morning, something small but powerful happened. One of the officers from that night, now in plain clothes, no badge, no gun, showed up at the local coffee shop during his community walk shift. He didn't wear a uniform, so no one knew who he was. He just ordered a coffee, sat by the window, and started talking to the barista, a young woman who'd lived in Oak Ridge her whole life. They talked about school, about her brother who wanted to be a firefighter, about how the park needed new benches. No suspicion, no tension, just two people sharing a moment. Later, he wrote in his reflection journal, "Today I didn't see a resident. I saw a person, and it felt like seeing clearly for the first time." Back at the station, the chief read that journal entry during a staff meeting. He didn't name the officer. He just said, "This is what we're aiming for. Not perfection, just progress, one real conversation at a time." And slowly, quietly, the department began to change, not with grand speeches, but with small acts of courage. An officer kneeling to talk to a scared kid instead of towering over him. A sergeant asking a caller how their day was going before taking a report. A rookie admitting, "I don't know, let me find out," instead of pretending to have all the answers. Because real trust isn't built in headlines. It's built in the everyday moments when someone chooses to see you, not as a case, not as a threat, not as a statistic, but as a human being. And that, more than any policy or program, was the real work ahead. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet hum of change began to settle into the rhythm of the city. But change, real change, doesn't happen in a straight line. It stumbles. It hesitates. It meets resistance in places you don't expect, even from people who say they want it. Inside the police department, not everyone was on board. Some officers grumbled in the locker room about too much hand-holding and political correctness. One veteran sergeant muttered during roll call, "We used to just do our jobs. Now we gotta walk on eggshells." But even he fell silent when a young recruit, fresh out of the academy, quietly said, "Sir, I'd rather walk on eggshells than break someone's trust." Outside the station, the community watched closely. Hope was there, but so was skepticism. People had heard promises before. They'd seen press conferences, new initiatives, shiny brochures, all of it fading into nothing after a few months. So this time they waited. They watched. They measured words against actions. Then came the first real test. A call came in one Tuesday afternoon. A teenager had been spotted loitering near the community center. Same neighborhood. Same kind of report that had sparked the incident weeks earlier. Only this time, the responding officer was one of the two who'd been through retraining. He arrived alone, no backup requested. He parked his cruiser a block away and walked the rest of the way, just like he'd been taught. When he saw the kid, a high schooler in a hoodie sitting on the steps with a sketchbook, he didn't approach with his hand on his belt. He just walked up slowly and said, "Hey, mind if I sit?" The teen looked up, surprised. Sure," they talked. The kid was drawing the old oak tree across the street, the same one from the park near the chief's house. He wasn't loitering. He was waiting for his little sister to finish her after-school program. The officer didn't ask for ID, didn't run his name, just asked about the drawing, complimented the shading, and told him about his own nephew who loved art. Before he left, he said, "If anyone ever gives you trouble just for sitting here, tell them Officer Ruiz sent you." Not as a threat, but as a promise of protection. Later that day, the chief got a call from the community center director. "You should know what happened today," she said. "It was different. That small moment didn't make the news. No one filmed it. But it traveled through the neighborhood like a quiet ripple. Parents told other parents. Kids told their friends. And slowly, the idea started to take root. Maybe things really were shifting still. Not everything was smooth. At the next Community Trust Council meeting, a man stood up, tall, gray-haired, voice rough from years of speaking up and being ignored. "You talk about change," he said, looking straight at the chief. "But last week my nephew got stopped 3 times in 2 days. Same block, same questions. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's studying to be an engineer." He paused. "So tell me, when does it stop being about a few bad apples and start being about the whole tree?" The room went still. The chief didn't deflect, didn't offer a rehearsed line. He just said, "You're right. It's not just a few. It's a system that's been trained to see certain people as problems first and people second. And fixing that takes more than training. It takes rewiring how we think." He announced a new pilot program that day. Stop logs. Every time an officer made a stop, whether it led to a ticket, a warning, or nothing at all, they had to fill out a simple form. Why did you stop this person? What did you observe? What was the outcome? And most importantly, would you have stopped someone who looked different under the same circumstances? It wasn't about punishment. It was about awareness, because you can't fix a pattern you refuse to see. Some officers hated it, called it busy work. But others, especially the younger ones, said it made them think twice before rolling up on someone just because they looked out of place. Meanwhile, the two officers who'd been on administrative duty were preparing to return to patrol. Their retraining was done. They'd walked neighborhoods in plain clothes. They'd sat in living rooms and listened to stories they'd never heard before. They'd even attended a session led by a man who'd been wrongfully arrested years ago, just for walking while black. One of them wrote in his final reflection, "I used to think bias was something other people had. Now I see it's something we all carry, and the real job is to keep checking it every single day." The night before their return, they met with the chief, not in his office, but at a diner downtown.
No uniforms, no titles.
Just three people sharing coffee and honesty. "I'm nervous," one admitted. "What if I mess up again?" The chief stirred his coffee slowly. "You might, we all do. But now you know the cost of that mistake, and you know there's another way. That's what matters." Back home, the chief's daughter had started a project at school, a community heroes poster. She didn't draw firefighters or doctors. She drew a police officer kneeling to talk to a little girl who'd lost her dog. Underneath, in bright marker, she'd written, "Heroes listen first." He tacked it to his office wall, right next to the official department mission statement. Out in the city, small signs of healing began to show. A local bakery started offering free coffee to officers who came in uniform, but only if they sat down and talked to someone who wasn't in law enforcement. A group of teens organized a walk and talk event where officers and residents walked the same streets together, sharing stories instead of suspicion. Even the news coverage shifted. Less scandal, more progress. Not because everything was perfect, but because people could see effort. Real, messy, human effort. And that, more than anything, gave folks hope. Because real change isn't about never falling. It's about how you get back up, and who you help up with you 6 months after that night on Oak Ridge Avenue. The city felt different, not because everything was fixed, but because people finally believed things could get better. The change wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't come with fireworks or headlines every day. But if you paid attention, you could see it in the small moments. An officer helping an elderly woman carry her groceries, a group of teens chatting easily with a patrol officer outside the library, a neighborhood meeting where both residents and police sat at the same table, not across from each other, but side by side. The Community Trust Council had become a real force. They met twice a month, not in a government building but in rotating locations, a church basement, a community center, even a local pizza shop. Everyone had a voice, and more importantly, everyone was heard. When someone raised a concern about late-night noise near the park, the council didn't just call for more patrols. They worked with teens to organize a weekend basketball league, giving kids a safe, fun place to be after dark. Crime didn't drop because of more cops. It dropped because there was less reason for trouble to start in the first place. The Stop Logs program had spread beyond the pilot phase. Every officer now filled one out after every street interaction that wasn't a 911 emergency. At first, many saw it as extra paperwork, but over time something shifted. During roll call, sergeants started sharing anonymized examples. Here's a stop that was based on solid observation, person matching a suspect description, acting nervously near a broken window. Good call. And then, here's one where the only reason listed was looked suspicious. Let's talk about what that really means. Those conversations weren't easy, but they were honest. And honesty, it turned out, built more trust than perfection ever could. The two officers who'd been involved in the original incident were back on full duty. But they weren't the same. They'd become quiet leaders in their own way. One started mentoring new recruits not just on procedure but on presence, how to stand, how to speak, how to listen. The other volunteered for the youth outreach program, showing up at schools not in uniform just as a regular adult who cared. Kids who once crossed the street to avoid cops now waved when they saw him. One afternoon, he was helping set up for a school career day when a boy tugged his sleeve. "Are you a police officer?" the kid asked. "I am," he said, kneeling to eye level. The boy hesitated. "My mom says some officers are nice, and some aren't." He didn't argue, didn't promise everything was perfect. He just said, "I'm trying to be one of the nice ones." Every single day, the boy nodded like that was enough for now. Back at headquarters, the chief had made another quiet change. Every new hire now spent their first week not in a classroom but in the community. They rode along with social workers. They visited food banks. They sat in on neighborhood cleanup days. The message was clear. Policing starts long before the badge goes on. It starts with understanding people's lives, their struggles, their joys, their fears. Even the mayor noticed the shift. At a city council meeting, she shared a story. "Last week, I saw an officer stop his car to help a family whose stroller had a flat tire. He didn't write a report, didn't radio it in. Just fixed it, smiled, and drove off. That's the kind of policing we've been missing." But not everyone was convinced. A small group of retired officers wrote a letter to the local paper. Calling the new approach soft and dangerous, they warned that coddling criminals would lead to chaos. The chief read the letter aloud at a staff meeting, not to mock it but to address it head on. "Fear is loud," he told his team. "But trust is stronger. We're not being soft. We're being smart. Because a community that trusts you will tell you things no radio call ever will. They'll help you solve crimes. They'll protect each other. And that's real safety." His words stuck, then came the real test of how far they'd come. One rainy evening, a 911 call came in. A man matching the description of a suspect in a recent string of convenience store robberies had been seen near the gas station on Elm Street. Same build, same jacket, hood up, walking fast. 2 officers responded. One was a veteran who'd been skeptical of all the new programs. The other was a rookie who'd joined after the changes began. They spotted the man near the pumps, head down, hands in his pockets. For a split second, the veteran's hand went to his belt. Old habits, old fears. But then he remembered the training, the logs, the conversations. He looked at his partner, who gave a small nod. Instead of rushing in, they parked a block away. Walked slowly. The veteran took a breath and said, "Hey, sir, got a minute?" The man turned, startled but not aggressive. He was holding a receipt. "Yeah?" "Just checking in," the veteran said, keeping his voice calm. "There's been some robberies nearby. You live around here?" Turns out the man was a night shift worker, just filling his car before heading home. He showed his ID, his work badge, even offered to call his boss to confirm. The officers thanked him, apologized for the interruption, and left. Later, the veteran wrote in his stop log, "Initial reaction was fear. But I paused, asked questions, listened, turned out to be a hardworking neighbor. Today I chose to see a person, not a profile." When the chief read that entry, he didn't post it online or make a speech. He just printed it out and pinned it to the break room bulletin board, right under the department motto, "Serve, protect, understand." That night, as he walked home again, hoodie on, earbuds in, podcast playing, he passed the same sidewalk where it all began. No one stopped him. No one even glanced twice. But that wasn't the victory. The victory was this. A few blocks down, he saw an officer sitting on a bench with an elderly man, sharing a bag of peanuts, laughing about something. No sirens, no tension, just 2 people, being human together. He smiled, kept walking, and for the first time in a long time, felt like the city was finally becoming the place he'd always believed it could be. Not perfect, but trying. And sometimes trying is enough to build something real. A year had passed since that night on Oak Ridge Avenue, and the city wasn't just healing, it was growing. Not in flashy ways, but in the kind of quiet, steady growth that lasts. You could see it in the way kids waved at patrol cars now, not out of fear, but because they recognized the faces behind the wheel. You could hear it in the tone of neighborhood meetings. Less anger, more problem-solving. And you could feel it in the air, like the whole town had taken a deep breath and decided to try something different. The Walk in My Shoes program, the one where officers spent a day in plain clothes. Just being part of the community had become one of the most talked about parts of the department. Officers signed up voluntarily now, not because they had to, but because they'd seen how it changed them. One officer spent a day riding the city bus with seniors going to the grocery store. Another helped out at a community garden, getting dirt under his nails and learning the names of neighbors he'd only ever seen through a windshield. One rookie even showed up at a youth center and just stayed, played chess, listened to music. Didn't mention he was police until someone asked. When they found out, instead of backing away, a group of teens said, "Wait, you're one of the good ones, right?" He didn't say yes or no. He just said, "I'm trying to be." And that was enough. The real magic wasn't in the program itself, but in what it revealed, that most people aren't looking for heroes in uniform. They're looking for neighbors who care. Meanwhile, the stop logs had become more than just paperwork. Every month, the department published a simple, easy-to-read report online. No jargon, just clear numbers and real reflections. Last month, 62% of stops happened in neighborhoods that make up only 20% of the city's population. We're looking into why. Or, officers reported 14 situations where they chose to walk away instead of escalate. Here's what they learned. Transparency didn't make the department look weak. It made it look human. And people responded to that. Even the skeptics started to soften. The retired officers who'd written that angry letter, one of them showed up at a community picnic, just as a guest, and ended up talking for an hour with a young officer about how policing had changed since his day. He didn't agree with everything, but he left saying, "At least they're trying to do it right." The chief kept walking his neighborhood most evenings, sometimes alone, sometimes with his daughter, and more often than not, someone would stop to say hello, not because of his title, but because they knew him as the guy who lived on the corner, who fixed Mrs. Lynn's fence last winter, who always asked how her grandkids were doing. One evening, as he passed the spot where he'd been pinned to the ground a year ago, he noticed something new. A small bench had been installed there, painted bright blue, with a little plaque that read, "For conversations that matter." It hadn't been put there by the city. It had been built by a group of high school students as part of a peace project for their civics class. He sat down for a minute, just to feel the weight of how far they'd come. Back at the station, the culture had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. New recruits weren't just tested on laws and tactics, they were asked, "Why do you want to serve this community?" And the best answers weren't about power or authority, they were about connection, about fairness, about making sure no one ever felt invisible. Training sessions now included role plays based on real calls from the past year, not just what to do if someone pulls a weapon, but what to do when a mom is yelling because her son was stopped for no reason. Officers practiced listening, apologizing when wrong, and sometimes just walking away. One sergeant, who'd once rolled his eyes at all this soft stuff, now started every shift by asking his team, "Who did you help today?" Not just arrest, help. And they'd answer, "I gave a ride to a kid whose bike chain broke. I called a social worker for a man sleeping in the bus shelter. I stayed with a lost toddler until her mom showed up, crying with relief." Those stories got shared more than arrest stats now. Even the dispatchers changed how they handled calls. Instead of just sending units out with suspicious person, they started asking callers, "What is the person actually doing?" If the answer was just standing there or walking, they'd gently suggest it might not need a police response, and offer to connect them with a community support line instead. It wasn't perfect. There were still tense moments, still misunderstandings, but now when something went wrong, the department didn't hide. They owned it, fixed it, learned from it, and the community noticed. At the annual city fair, the police booth wasn't just handing out stickers and toy badges. They had a community ideas wall where people could write suggestions on sticky notes. Some were silly, more donut days. Some were serious, more female officers on night patrol. But every single one was read, and many were acted on. One note in a child's handwriting said, "Can officers come to my school and just talk? Not about rules, about dreams." The next week, 3 officers showed up, not in uniform, just in polos, and spent an hour talking to 5th graders about what they wanted to be when they grew up. One kid said, "I want to be a cop who helps people feel safe." An officer smiled and said, "Then you're already halfway there." The chief didn't take credit for any of it. When reporters asked how he'd turned things around, he always said the same thing. "I didn't, we all did. The officers who changed. The neighbors who spoke up. The kids who still believe in us." This was never about one person. It was about all of us choosing to see each other clearly. And that, more than any policy or program, was the heart of it. Because real safety doesn't come from fear. It comes from knowing that the person walking toward you, whether in a uniform or a hoodie, is someone who sees you. Really sees you, and in this city that was no longer a dream. It was becoming a habit. 2 years after that night on Oak Ridge Avenue, the city had become something rare. Not perfect, but trusted. People still locked their doors. Crime still happened, but the fear that used to hang in the air like fog had lifted. In its place was something quieter, stronger. A sense that everyone belonged and everyone mattered. The bench painted blue still sat on the corner where it all began. Now it was worn smooth from use. Kids sat there after school, elders rested there on their walks, and sometimes officers and residents shared a coffee there just talking. No agenda, no uniforms. Just people. The police department looked different too. The lobby wasn't just for filing reports anymore. It had a little reading nook for kids, a community bulletin board covered in flyers for bake sales and tutoring, and a wall of thanks where people pinned notes like, "Officer Diaz helped me find my dog, thank you," or "Thanks for walking my grandma home last week." It wasn't fancy, but it felt like home. New officers didn't start with weapons training. They started with listening circles, sitting in a room with residents hearing stories about what it felt like to be stopped, followed, or ignored. One recruit later said, "I thought I was coming to protect the community. I didn't realize I first had to learn how to be part of it." The 2 officers from that night were still on the force, but they'd become something unexpected. Teachers. They led workshops not just for rookies, but for departments from other cities who'd heard about the changes and wanted to learn. They never bragged. They just told the truth. We messed up. And that mistake taught us more than any training ever could. One of them now ran the youth mentorship program. Every Saturday he met with a group of teens at the rec center, not to keep them out of trouble, but to help them build something better. They painted murals, organized cleanups, even started a podcast about life in their neighborhood. When a local reporter asked one teen why he joined, he said, "Because someone finally asked what I wanted to build, not what I might break." The chief still walked his neighborhood most evenings, but now he often wasn't alone. Sometimes his daughter tagged along, sometimes a neighbor joined him for a lap around the block, and sometimes an officer off duty would fall into step beside him, not to guard him, but just to talk about work, about family, about how hard it still was some days to do this job right. He never forgot that night. Not the pain of being slammed to the ground, but the lesson it carried. That no badge, no title, no years of service can protect you from bias if the system itself is blind. But that same moment also became the seed of something new, a reminder that change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes, it starts with one person on the ground saying, "This isn't right," and having the courage to stand back up and fix it. The city had become a model, not because it had all the answers, but because it was willing to ask the hard questions and listen to the answers, even when they hurt. Schools invited officers to career days, not as authority figures, but as neighbors. Local businesses gave discounts to officers who completed community service hours. And the annual Neighbor Night event, where police and residents cooked food together, played games and shared stories, now drew hundreds, rain or shine. One evening during that event, a little girl tugged on an officer's sleeve.
Are you the police?
She asked. "I am," he said, kneeling down. She studied him for a moment, then said, "My dad says you used to scare him, but you don't scare me." He smiled gently. "Good. I don't want to scare anyone." "No," she said, handing him a paper plate with a slightly burnt cookie. "You're just nice." And in that simple moment, the whole journey made sense. Because real safety isn't measured in arrests or response times. It's measured in trust, in whether a child feels safe enough to hand you a cookie, whether a teenager believes you'll listen before you judge, whether an elder feels seen, not suspicious. The department still had work to do. There were still calls that went sideways, Still moments of tension, still days when old habits tried to creep back in. But now there was a system and a culture that caught those moments before they became crises. Officers checked in on each other. "You good?" Wasn't just a greeting, it was a lifeline. Sergeants held reset circles after tough shifts, not to assign blame but to heal, and the chief made it a point to eat lunch in the break room at least once a week, just to hear what was really going on. One afternoon, he found a note slipped under his office door. No name, just a few lines. "Thank you for not giving up on us, or on yourself." He taped it to his desk right next to his daughter's old community heroes drawing. Years later, when people looked back on that time, they wouldn't remember the headlines or the viral video. They'd remember the small things. The officer who helped carry groceries, the teen who started a peace garden, the bench where strangers became friends. Because change like this doesn't roar. It whispers, in shared glances, in second chances. In the quiet decision every single day to see the person before the uniform, or the hoodie. And in this city, that whisper had become a promise that no one would ever be reduced to a suspicion again. Not on the chief's watch, not on anyone's watch, because in the end, justice isn't just about laws. It's about looking someone in the eye and saying, without words, "I see you, and you belong here." And that, more than anything, was the legacy of that night on Oak Ridge Avenue. Not shame, not blame, but a new beginning, built one honest moment at a time.